They called her the Wolf Witch of Ashford Vale, though Thora had never once cast a spell in her life, unless you counted the particular magic of convincing 18 orphaned, rejected, half-feral pups that they were worth feeding, worth naming, worth loving despite every pack that had cast them out. The village had tolerated her for 3 years, tolerated the strange woman on the forest's edge who took in what no one else wanted, the runt too small to survive a normal litter, the pup born wrong-sided and abandoned at birth, the survivors of a culled pack no territory would claim. Tolerance in Ashford Vale had always been a thin, conditional thing. It broke entirely the night Elder Marsh's prize hound went missing and was found, 3 days later, alive and well, curled among Thora's pack in the barn she'd built with her own 2 hands. Thief, they called her. Witch. Someone threw a stone. Someone else struck a torch to the barn's edge before cooler heads intervened, and by dawn, Thora stood at the village gates with 18 pups pressed close around her legs and nowhere left in the world that wanted either of them. She walked north because north was simply the direction her feet chose, rain soaking through her cloak. 18 small bodies shivering and exhausted around her, and she did not cry, because crying had never once solved a single problem in her entire difficult life. It was near midnight, the storm at its worst, when she saw the castle rising black against the clouds, and the tall, grim figure of a man on horseback, watching her from the road with an expression she couldn't yet read. She didn't know his name. She didn't know he'd buried a wife 3 years ago, and buried, alongside her, every soft thing he'd once been. She only knew she was cold and exhausted, and responsible for 18 lives that trusted her completely.
Can we sleep?
Can we sleep in your barn? She asked, plain and unafraid, rain dripping from her chin. Neither of them knew, that storm-soaked midnight, exactly how much that single request was about to change. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The castle gates loomed massive and unwelcoming against the storm, and Thora found herself sizing up the man on horseback with the same wary assessment she gave any stranger who might prove a threat to her pack. Broad shoulders, a scar cutting through one eyebrow, eyes that held none of the warmth his voice's quiet invitation had suggested. "You're staring," he observed, dismounting with the particular economy of movement that suggested a man who'd once been a soldier before he'd been a king. "I'm assessing whether you intend to hand me over to whoever's chasing 18 pups and a woman through a storm at midnight. Forgive me for taking the precaution." Something that might have been surprise flickered across his weathered face. "No one's chasing you that I can see." "Not tonight. Ask me again in a week, once word spreads that Ashford Vale ran off its wolf witch." She said it without self-pity, simply a fact laid plain, and gestured to the pups pressed close around her ankles, soaked and shivering. "They need shelter before anything else. I'll answer whatever questions you have after that." The king studied her a long moment, not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular careful attention of a man unused to being given orders inside his own gates, and apparently deciding, despite that, not to object to it. "This way," he said simply, and led them toward a barn set apart from the main stables, dry and warm despite the storm outside. The barn, once they were settled inside, proved considerably better appointed than Thora had expected. Clean straw, a working lantern, even a stack of old but serviceable blankets tucked into a corner chest. "You keep this maintained for horses that don't currently exist here," she observed, noting the empty stalls. "We had considerably more livestock once." "Before." He didn't finish the sentence, and something in the abrupt silence told Thora exactly which direction not to push, at least not yet. "I'm Thora," she offered instead, kneeling to help the smallest of her pups, a 3-legged runt she'd named Scrap for lack of a better inspiration, settle into a dry patch of straw. "Corvin," he said, and something flickered behind his eyes at the plain, unadorned way she'd simply offered her name without title or performance, the way most visitors to his castle rarely managed anymore. "You're the king." "I am." "You don't seem particularly thrilled about it." Something almost like a laugh escaped him, short, rusty, clearly unused to the sensation. "Few people speak to me quite that directly anymore. I've found directness saves considerable time, especially when you're soaked through and responsible for 18 shivering lives who'd very much like their dinner." She glanced up at him, something assessing in her gaze. "Do you have food to spare, or should I go hunting in this storm? I'll have the kitchens send something." He hesitated, watching her work through the pack with practiced, efficient care, checking each pup for injury, settling them in careful groupings by size and temperament, the whole process betraying years of exactly this kind of labor. 18. That's a considerable number to care for alone. It's a considerable number for anyone. I manage. Managing and thriving aren't the same thing. No, Thora agreed, meeting his eyes directly. They're not. But I've found thriving is a luxury the world doesn't often extend to women who take in what everyone else discards. Managing will do for now. The kitchens, when word reached them, responded with considerably more reluctance than Corvin's simple instruction should have warranted. A fact Thora noted with interest as a young serving girl arrived nearly an hour later. Expression carefully blank in the particular way of someone following orders she resented. "Your Majesty," the girl said, setting down a tray with more force than strictly necessary. "The staff wished me to convey that feeding 18 wild animals stretches the kitchen's resources considerably, given the current season's stores." "Then the staff can convey their concerns to me directly, rather than through you, Marcella," Corvin said, something tired and worn in his voice, like a conversation he'd had too many times to count. Marcella's jaw tightened, something old and bitter flashing behind her careful composure before she smoothed it away. "As you say, Your Majesty." She left without another word, though the door closed behind her with more force than necessary. "She doesn't care for you much," Thora observed, watching the exchange with open curiosity. "She doesn't care for me at all, if we're being honest. Which you seem determined to be regardless of whether it's welcome." Corvin's mouth twisted, something bitter in the expression. "She has reason enough. I wasn't always the kind of king easy to serve." "What happened to you?" The question landed bluntly, and Corvin's expression shuddered immediately, old grief closing over whatever had briefly opened during their exchange. "That's not a story for a storm-soaked midnight," he said finally. "Fair enough." Thora didn't push further, turning back to her pack instead, though she filed the exchange away with the same careful attention she gave everything. The tension between king and servant, the grief he clearly still carried, the particular hollowness in his voice when he spoke of who he used to be. She was still settling the pups an hour later, exhaustion pulling hard at every muscle, when Corvin returned unexpectedly, carrying a second lantern and, to her genuine surprise, a proper meal balanced awkwardly on a tray he'd clearly carried himself. "Marcella again?" she asked, eyeing the tray. "I decided the request would be better received coming personally, given the staff's reluctance." He set the tray down, something almost sheepish in the admission. "I confess I haven't carried my own meals since before I was crowned. I may have dropped a roll somewhere along the corridor." Despite her exhaustion, Thora laughed, a real, surprised sound that seemed to startle Corvin as much as it startled her. The great Alpha King, defeated by a bread roll. "I contain multitudes of embarrassing failures. Bread rolls are simply the most recent addition." Something in his tone had genuinely lightened, however briefly, and Thora found herself studying him with fresh curiosity. The tired grief still evident beneath the surface, but something else there too, something that might, given room to breathe, prove considerably warmer than the bitter reputation clearly preceding him through his own castle. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. For the food, for the shelter, for not simply turning us away at the gate, which I confess I half expected. You were standing in a storm with 18 pups who trusted you completely to keep them safe. I've done a great many things I'm not proud of these past 3 years, but I haven't yet sunk low enough to turn away someone in that particular situation. Something dark moved behind his eyes, quickly suppressed. Whatever else I've become. What did you become exactly? You keep alluding to it without saying it plainly? Corvin was quiet a long moment, watching the pups settle into exhausted sleep around them, the storm still raging faintly outside. I lost my wife 3 years ago, he said finally, voice rough. Fever. Sudden. Nothing anyone could have prevented. Though I've spent 3 years searching for someone to blame regardless. I was not gentle in my grief. I said things to my staff, to my counsel, to anyone within reach of my temper, that I've never properly apologized for. Marcella lost someone dear to her that same season, to my own carelessness in a decision I made too quickly, too angrily. I don't fully blame her for the hatred she carries. That's a heavy confession for a storm-soaked midnight. You did ask directly. I found myself unexpectedly willing to answer just as directly. He glanced at her, something rueful in his tired expression. You have a way of making bluntness feel like safety rather than intrusion. I'm not entirely certain how you manage that. Practice, mostly, and a considerable unwillingness to pretend things are simpler than they actually are. Thora settled back against a stack of hay, exhaustion finally overtaking her properly now that the pups were settled and fed. I found people generally respond better to honest bluntness than careful performance once they get past the initial surprise of it. They talked longer than either of them likely intended, Corvin telling her in careful pieces about the wife he'd lost, about the particular grief that had curdled into something bitter and untouchable over 3 isolated years. Thora telling him, in turn, about the 18 pups scattered around them, each one a story of rejection and rescue that had, slowly, built into the only family she'd ever properly claimed as her own. Scrap there, she said, nodding toward the 3-legged runt curled against her side, was left to die by his birth pack. Too small, too weak, not worth the resources to raise properly. I found him 3 days old, barely breathing, in a ditch outside Ashford Vale. And you simply took him in. I simply couldn't leave him there. That's rather been the pattern of my entire adult life, if I'm honest. I see something the world's decided isn't worth saving, and I find myself constitutionally incapable of walking past it. That's not a flaw, whatever the village apparently made you believe about it. No, Thora agreed, something warm and surprised in her voice at hearing it stated so plainly. I've come to believe that myself, slowly over considerable time and considerable rejection. It's good to hear someone else say it aloud, though. Corvin studied her in the lantern light, soaked through, exhausted, surrounded by 18 creatures the world had discarded and building, from nothing but sheer stubborn will, something that looked remarkably like family. And something in his tired, grief-worn expression shifted into what might, given time, become genuine warmth. You may stay as long as you need, he said quietly. The barn, the castle grounds, whatever proves necessary. I find myself unexpectedly wanting you to stay considerably longer than one storm-soaked night. That's a generous offer from a man I met 3 hours ago. I contain multitudes of poor decisions, apparently. Perhaps this one will prove the exception. A ghost of a genuine smile crossed his face, brief but real, the first Thora suspected he'd offered anyone in longer than he'd admit. Outside, the storm continued its assault against the castle walls, but inside the barn, surrounded by 18 sleeping pups and the cautious beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet, the night had settled, unexpectedly, into something that felt considerably warmer than either of them had walked into it expecting. Thora woke to the sound of chaos, which, given 18 pups sharing one barn, was less a surprise and more simply Tuesday. "Absolutely not," she muttered into the straw, not yet opening her eyes. "We discussed this. The king's boots are not breakfast." A muffled, guilty whine answered her from somewhere near the door, followed by the distinct sound of leather being reluctantly released. She opened her eyes to find Corvin standing in the barn entrance, one boot considerably more damp than the other, regarding the pup responsible. A barrel-chested troublemaker Thora had named Biscuit, for reasons that had made sense at 3 a.m. 3 years ago and had never been reconsidered since, with an expression caught somewhere between offense and reluctant amusement. "Your Majesty," Thora said, sitting up and attempting to look considerably more composed than a woman who'd slept in a barn had any right to. "I apologize. Biscuit has opinions about footwear, mostly that it should belong to him. I've owned this pair for 4 years. I confess I'm somewhat attached to them remaining unchewed. I'll add it to his growing list of grievances against him personally. It's a long list. He's ambitious." Thora rose, brushing straw from her cloak with brisk efficiency, and surveyed the scene properly. 17 other pups in various states of morning mischief, one attempting to climb into the water trough, 2 engaged in a wrestling match that had already knocked over a stack of blankets, and Scrap, the small 3-legged runt, watching the whole proceedings from a safe distance with the weary disapproval of a creature who considered himself above such chaos. "This is fairly ordinary, I take it," Corvin observed, watching a third pup make a valiant, unsuccessful attempt to steal his remaining boot. "This is a slow morning, actually. You should see them when they're properly motivated." Thora scooped up the boot thief before he could make good on his ambitions, tucking him under one arm with the casual competence of long practice. "I promise we'll be considerably less destructive once everyone's fed and properly exercised. Chaos generally correlates directly with unmet needs, in my experience. Applies to pups and people both, honestly. That's a remarkably practical philosophy for 18 o'clock in the morning. I've had years of practice developing philosophies that survive contact with actual chaos. Most don't." Breakfast, when it arrived, came without Marcella this time, instead delivered by an older woman with flour-dusted hands and a no-nonsense expression that Thora immediately, instinctively trusted. "Agnes," the woman introduced herself, setting down a considerably more generous tray than the previous night's offering. "Head cook, for my sins. Heard we had 18 new mouths to feed and decided I'd rather see the situation myself than trust Marcella's account of it, which I'd wager was considerably less charitable than reality warranted." "You'd wager correctly," Thora said, watching the pups descend on the food with enthusiastic, undignified speed. Agnes surveyed the chaos with open delight rather than dismay. "Well, I'll say this for you, girl. This castle's been entirely too quiet these past 3 years. A bit of proper chaos might do us all some good." She glanced toward Corvin with the particular directness of a servant who'd clearly earned the right to speak plainly through decades of service. "You look better this morning, Your Majesty. Less like a man carved from stone." "I slept considerably less than usual," Corvin said. "I confess I'm not certain why that would improve my appearance. Perhaps it's not the sleep. Perhaps it's the company." Agnes shot Thora a knowing look that made Thora's ears heat slightly, though she covered it by pretending sudden, urgent interest in separating 2 pups currently disputing ownership of a particularly appealing strip of bacon. "Agnes has strong opinions she shares regardless of invitation," Corvin said, though there was real warmth beneath the complaint. "Someone has to. Given how thoroughly this castle's forgotten how to speak plainly to you these past 3 years. Agnes patted his arm with brisk affection before departing, leaving both of them in a silence that had gone, unexpectedly, a little awkward. The morning passed in a blur of practical chaos, Thora organizing her pack into something resembling manageable groups, Corvin, to her genuine surprise, remaining to help rather than retreating to whatever kingly business presumably awaited him. "You don't have a council meeting or something similarly important?" she asked, watching him attempt, with visible determination, to teach Scrap to walk properly on his 3 legs across an obstacle of hay bales. "I do. I've decided it can wait an hour." He glanced up, something almost defensive in his expression. "Is that objectionable?" "Not remotely. I'm simply surprised a king finds time for pup obstacle courses." "I find myself surprised by it as well, if I'm honest." Scrap made it across the final hay bale, and Corvin's face broke into something genuinely delighted, quickly suppressed but not quickly enough for Thora to miss it entirely. "I haven't done anything this simply, purely enjoyable in longer than I can properly remember. Grief has a way of making joy feel like betrayal, for a while," Thora said quietly. "I lost my mother when I was young. I remember feeling guilty for years, any time I laughed properly, like I was somehow dishonoring her memory by finding happiness without her in it." Corvin went still, something raw crossing his weathered face. "How did you stop feeling that way?" "I'm not certain I ever fully did. I think eventually, I simply decided joy wasn't a betrayal, but a continuation, that she'd have wanted me laughing properly, rather than performing grief indefinitely as some kind of tribute." She watched Scrap attempt the obstacle course a second time, wobbling but determined. "I don't know if that helps exactly. Grief's rarely simple enough for advice to fix it properly." "It helps more than you'd think," Corvin said quietly. "I've had 3 years of people either avoiding the subject entirely or offering hollow practice sympathy that changes nothing. You're the first person who's spoken about it like something real, rather than something to be managed carefully around. I told you. Bluntness saves considerable time." She glanced at him, something warmer than simple bluntness in her expression now. "Though I'll admit, I don't offer it to just anyone. Something about you seems to invite it." "I'll choose to take that as a compliment." "You should. It's meant as one." It was Marcella who found Thora alone that afternoon in the small courtyard adjoining the barn, tending a scrape on one pup's paw with careful, practiced hands. "You should leave," Marcella said without preamble, arms crossed, expression carefully arranged into something cold, "before you get too comfortable here." Thora didn't look up immediately, finishing her careful bandaging before addressing the interruption. "That's a fairly direct greeting from someone I haven't properly met yet. I don't need pleasantries to tell you the truth. This castle isn't a home for strays, whatever the king's momentary sentiment suggests otherwise. I'm aware what this castle is, Marcella. I've been here less than a day and already gathered considerable information about its current temperature toward outsiders." Thora finally looked up, meeting the younger woman's hostile gaze directly. "You lost someone. Because of him. That's what I've heard, at least, in careful pieces." Something flickered across Marcella's face. Surprise, quickly smothered by fresh anger. "He told you that." "He told me enough to understand you have real reason for the anger you're carrying. I'm not here to argue you out of grief that's clearly still raw." "Then why are you here exactly, beyond charming your way through his defenses with 18 sad-eyed strays and careful bluntness?" The accusation landed sharp, and Thora set down her bandaging supplies fully now, giving Marcella her complete attention. "I'm here because I was thrown out of my own village for the crime of caring for creatures no one else wanted. And your king happened to be the first person in considerable time willing to offer shelter without demanding something in return for it." Thora's voice had gone steady, unbothered by the hostility, but unwilling to simply absorb it without response. "I'm not here to charm anyone into anything. I'm here because 18 lives depend on me finding them safety, and this castle, whatever its current temperature, offered exactly that." Marcella's composure cracked slightly, old grief showing through the careful anger. "My brother," she said finally, voice tight. "He served in the King's Guard. 3 years ago, during the fever that took the Queen, the King ordered a patrol into territory everyone knew was compromised, too angry and too grief-stricken to properly assess the risk. My brother didn't return from it." Something in Thora's chest ached at that, understanding settling in with real weight. That's not a small thing to carry. No, Marcella agreed. It's not. And I've watched this castle slowly forget it, slowly move on, while I'm still here, every single day, serving the man whose grief cost me my own family. Her voice cracked slightly. You arrive with your strays and your easy bluntness, and already he looks lighter than he has in 3 years. It feels like watching everyone else's healing happen at the expense of remembering what it actually caused. Thora was quiet a long moment, considering the raw honesty of that admission with the same careful attention she gave everything. I won't pretend to know exactly what that grief feels like, she said finally. But I understand, better than most, what it's like to watch the world move forward without properly acknowledging what someone lost along the way. My pups understand it too, in their own way. Every one of them was left behind by someone who decided moving forward mattered more than accounting for what got left behind in the process. Something in Marcella's expression shifted, surprised by the unexpected empathy. I'm not asking you to forgive him, Thora continued. That's not mine to ask for, and I suspect it's not something that happens quickly regardless. I'm only telling you that whatever's changing in him, it doesn't erase what you lost, or minimize the right you have to still be angry about it. Marcella studied her a long moment, old hostility warring with something more complicated now. You're not what I expected when Agnes described you this morning. What did you expect? Someone naive. Someone who'd charm her way into royal favor without understanding the real damage underneath this castle's current peace. A ghost of something almost like respect crossed her face. I still don't trust easily, especially not around him, but I'll admit you're considerably more clear-eyed about this situation than I expected. I contain multitudes, Thora said, echoing a phrase she'd apparently absorbed from Corvin's own dry humor, without quite meaning to, and was rewarded with the faintest, most reluctant twitch of amusement from Marcella, before the younger woman turned and left without further comment. That evening, Thora found Corvin in the castle's small library, poring over correspondence with the particular weary focus of a man determined to catch up on duties he'd neglected all day. I spoke with Marcella, she said, settling into the chair across from him without invitation. Corvin's expression tightened immediately. I imagine that conversation went about as warmly as every other one she's had with me these past 3 years. She told me about her brother. Something in his face went carefully blank, old guilt surfacing beneath the practiced composure. Then you understand exactly why she hates me. I understand why she's angry. I'm not certain hatred and anger are quite the same thing, though I imagine they've felt indistinguishable to her for considerable time now. Thora studied him carefully. Have you ever properly apologized to her? Not simply allowed her continued employment out of guilt, but actually sat with her and acknowledged what your decision cost her directly? Corvin was quiet a long moment, something raw and uncomfortable moving behind his tired eyes. I've tried, several times. She's never wanted to hear it. I've come to believe my apology would only serve my own guilt rather than actually helping her. Maybe. Or maybe you've simply never tried hard enough to make it land properly, because facing her grief directly means facing your own failure just as directly. Thora said it gently, but without softening the truth of it. Grief that's been denied a proper reckoning has a way of calcifying into something harder to move past. Maybe it's worth trying again, properly this time, rather than assuming the door's permanently closed. Corvin studied her for a long moment, something complicated and grateful in his tired expression. You have a talent for saying difficult things in a way that doesn't feel like an attack. I've had considerable practice, being blunt with animals who can't understand nuance and people who've forgotten how to hear it properly. A small, genuine smile crossed her face. Besides, I find I'd rather tell you a difficult truth than watch you continue carrying guilt that's actually solvable, if you're brave enough to actually try solving it. I find myself increasingly wanting to be exactly that brave, Corvin said quietly, something warm and certain settling into his tired expression as he watched her across the lantern-lit library. "Thank you, Thora, for the bluntness, for the difficult truths, for reminding me, in less than 2 days, what it feels like to actually want to become better rather than simply survive being broken." "Don't thank me yet," Thora said, though her voice had gone soft despite the teasing edge. "You still have 18 pups determined to destroy your boots and a serving girl who's owed a considerably more genuine apology than you've apparently managed yet. The hard work's still ahead of you. I find myself unexpectedly looking forward to it anyway." By the end of the first week, Thora had settled into a routine at Castle Blackwood that felt disconcertingly more like home than anywhere she'd lived in the past 3 years, which was precisely why she found herself lying awake some nights, waiting for the inevitable moment it would all be taken away again. "You're brooding," Agnes observed, arriving at the barn with the morning's provisions and immediately clocking Thora's distracted expression. "I recognize brooding. I raised 4 children and buried a husband. I've seen every variety of brooding there is." "I'm not brooding. I'm cataloging." "Cataloging what, exactly?" "Reasons this might not last." Thora nodded toward the pups, currently engaged in their usual morning chaos. Biscuits chewed through 2 pairs of the king's boots this week alone. Marigold keeps escaping the barn to investigate the kitchen gardens, and I suspect she's single-handedly responsible for the disappearance of at least 1 entire row of carrots. Juniper and Ash refuse to be separated for even a moment, which makes training either of them individually nearly impossible. Eventually, patience runs out. It always has before. Agnes settled onto an overturned crate with the particular weight of a woman prepared to deliver an opinion regardless of whether it was requested. "Girl, I've watched that man carry grief like a stone around his neck for 3 years. I've watched this castle grow quieter and colder with every season that stone got heavier. In 1 week, you've had him teaching a 3-legged pup to walk obstacle courses and apparently laughing at his own ruined boots rather than raging about them. If you think that's the kind of change that simply runs out of patience, you haven't been paying proper attention to what's actually happening here. I've been thrown out of enough places to know good things rarely last, Agnes. Call it hard-won caution. Call it borrowed trouble, more like." Agnes patted her knee with brisk affection. "Eat your breakfast, girl. Worry less about the ending before you've even properly started the story." It was Marigold, a sharp-eared, endlessly curious pup with a coat the exact color of autumn leaves, who caused the morning's first real crisis, having successfully tunneled beneath the barn's back fence and made her way, by all accounts, directly into the castle's formal rose garden. "She's eaten Lord Ashford's prize blooms," Marcella reported, arriving with an expression caught somewhere between exasperation and, Thora noted with interest, poorly suppressed amusement. "The entire visiting delegation is currently standing in the garden watching a wolf pup demolish 3 years of careful cultivation." Thora was moving before Marcella finished the sentence, though by the time she reached the garden, the damage, and the audience, had grown considerably. Marigold sat in the center of the ruined rose bed, petals scattered around her with the guilty satisfaction of a creature entirely unrepentant about her crimes, while a delegation of visiting nobles looked on with expressions ranging from horror to, in one case, badly hidden delight. "I do apologize," Thora said, scooping up the offending pup, who immediately attempted to lick her face in a transparent bid for forgiveness. "She has strong opinions about which flowers are edible. Her judgment on the matter is, admittedly, poor." To her genuine surprise, it was Corvin who laughed first, a real, warm sound that carried across the garden and drew every eye toward him with visible astonishment. "Lord Ashford," he said, still clearly fighting a smile, "I believe this represents the first genuine excitement your gardens produced in years. I'll have new roses sent from the Eastern Nursery, with my sincere apologies for my newest resident's culinary adventurousness." Lord Ashford, an older nobleman whose stern expression cracked slowly into reluctant amusement, shook his head. Your Majesty, I confess I haven't seen you laugh properly since before the Queen's passing. If a wolf pup's appetite for roses achieves that, I'm inclined to forgive the roses entirely. Something in Corvin's expression shifted at that. Surprise, quickly followed by a kind of quiet, humbled acknowledgement. And Thora, watching the exchange, felt her chest tighten with something that had nothing to do with worry about Marigold's continued garden crimes. That evening, with the delegation departed and the Rose's fate formally forgiven, Corvin found Thora in the barn, attempting to explain to Marigold with limited success the difference between acceptable and unacceptable foraging targets. You've caused something of a stir, he said, settling onto a hay bale nearby, watching Marigold ignore every word of Thora's careful lecture in favor of investigating his boots with renewed interest. I've caused something of a stir since arriving, apparently. Marigold's simply the latest chapter. I don't mean the roses. I mean you, generally. He was quiet a moment, something thoughtful in his expression. Lord Ashford mentioned something on his way out. Said the whole delegation noticed I seemed lighter than they'd seen me in years. Said several of them had privately begun wondering if the king's grief had simply become permanent. Had it? I'd started to believe so, yes. Corvin reached down, scratching Marigold's ears with an easy familiarity that suggested he'd stopped noticing. At some point this past week, how naturally the gesture had become habit. I'd convinced myself that bitterness was simply who I'd become, permanently, the same way losing a leg might permanently alter how a person walks. Something structural, rather than something I was choosing to carry. And now? Now I've watched Scrap learn to navigate an obstacle course on 3 legs through sheer stubborn determination, and I find myself wondering if I've simply been choosing not to try, rather than genuinely incapable of it. He glanced at her. You have a way of making structural grief feel considerably more optional than I'd convinced myself it was. I don't think grief is ever entirely optional, Thora said carefully, but I do think how we carry it, whether we let it calcify into permanent bitterness or whether we let it soften into something we've made peace with, that part's more choice than most people admit. You speak like someone who's done exactly that work herself. I've had considerable practice, losing my mother young, being cast out of every place I've tried to call home since, watching the world decide, repeatedly, that I wasn't worth the trouble of keeping around properly. She scratched behind Marigold's ears, matching his earlier gesture without quite meaning to. I could have let all of that calcify into bitterness. Some days, honestly, I still fight the pull toward exactly that. But I've decided over and over that bitterness costs more than it protects. I'd rather keep choosing softness, even when it's difficult. Corvin studied her in the lantern light, something warm and genuinely moved in his tired expression. I find myself, increasingly, grateful you decided to knock on my gate that particular storm-soaked night. I didn't knock. I simply stood there looking pathetic until you offered shelter out of pity. You did not look remotely pathetic. You looked like a woman entirely capable of surviving whatever the world threw at her, who'd simply run out of patience for doing it alone that particular night. He said it plainly, without performance, and something in the directness made Thora's breath catch slightly. That's a remarkably generous read of a soaked, exhausted stranger with 18 chaotic pups. I contain multitudes of generous reads, apparently. You've been a rather significant influence this past week. It was Ash, the quieter of the inseparable pair Thora had named Juniper and Ash, who provided the unexpected bridge between Corvin and Marcella that neither of them had managed to build themselves. The pup had gone missing during the evening feeding, a rare occurrence, given how tightly bonded he stayed to his sister Juniper. And Thora's search led her eventually to the castle's small chapel, where she found Ash curled quietly beside Marcella, who knelt before a modest memorial stone Thora hadn't noticed on her previous visits. I'm sorry, Thora said quietly, moving to collect the pup. I didn't mean to intrude. You're not intruding. Marcella's voice was rough, clearly interrupted mid-grief rather than simply disturbed. He found me here 20 minutes ago. Wouldn't leave no matter how many times I told him to. Thora glanced at the memorial stone, understanding settling in immediately. Your brother. Karan, Marcella said, voice cracking slightly on the name. I come here most evenings. It's the only place in this entire castle that still feels like it properly remembers him, rather than simply moving forward like his loss was some minor administrative inconvenience. Ash, sensing the weight of the moment despite his young age, pressed closer against Marcella's side, offering the same quiet, steady comfort Thora had watched him extend to his sister Juniper during her own occasional distress. He has a talent for that, Thora said softly, knowing exactly when someone needs quiet company rather than solutions. He's a good creature. Marcella's hand found Ash's head, scratching gently despite the tears still tracking down her face. I didn't expect to find comfort in one of your strays, of all things. I've spent this whole week resenting your presence here. You're allowed to resent me and still accept comfort from Ash simultaneously. Those aren't contradictory. Marcella let out a wet, unsteady laugh. You really do speak in exactly the same blunt way regardless of circumstance, don't you? I've found it saves considerable time, particularly in moments this heavy. Thora settled onto the chapel floor beside her, giving Marcella space rather than pushing for more conversation than she was ready to offer. They sat together in silence for several minutes, Ash providing steady, warm comfort between them, before Marcella finally spoke again. I overheard you and the king, in the library, several nights ago, she admitted. About Karan, about whether he'd ever properly apologized. Thora went still, uncertain how much of that conversation Marcella had actually heard. I hope I didn't overstep, discussing something so personal to you without your knowledge. You didn't say anything untrue. That's rather the problem. Marcella wiped at her face, composure fraying at the edges. I've spent 3 years certain that hating him properly was the only way to honor Corin's memory, that forgiving him even partially would somehow mean his death mattered less. Grief doesn't usually work that neatly, in my experience. No, Marcella agreed. It doesn't. But it's easier to be furious than to sit with how genuinely complicated it actually is, that he's not simply a villain, that his grief over the Queen was real even as it drove him to a decision that cost me my brother. She looked at Thora directly. You told me that first day that anger and hatred aren't quite the same thing. I've been turning that over all week. And I think you might be right, which is deeply inconvenient, because hatred was considerably simpler to carry than whatever this more complicated feeling actually is. It was Corvin himself who arrived a few minutes later, having apparently gone searching for both Thora and the missing pup, and stopped short in the chapel doorway at the sight of Marcella and Thora seated together before Corin's memorial stone. I'll leave, he said immediately, already retreating. I didn't mean to intrude on— Stay, Marcella said, surprising all three of them, her voice unsteady but certain. Actually, I think I'd like you to stay, if you're willing to actually hear what I need to say, rather than simply absorbing my anger the way you have these past 3 years. Corvin went very still, something cautious and hopeful moving across his tired face. I'm willing. I've been willing for 3 years, if I'm honest. I simply never believed you wanted to hear anything I had to offer. I didn't. For a long time, I genuinely didn't. Marcella's hand found Ash's head again, steadying herself through the pup's quiet warmth. I need you to understand properly what that decision cost me. Not simply that Corin died, but that he died because your grief made you careless with lives that weren't yours to gamble with so recklessly. I know, Corvin said, voice rough with 3 years of accumulated guilt. I've known since the day the news reached me. I've simply never found the courage to say the full weight of that acknowledgement aloud to you directly, because I was afraid it would sound like an excuse rather than genuine accountability. Say it anyway, Marcella said. Properly. I think I'm finally ready to actually hear it, rather than simply bracing against whatever version of apology I expected from you. Corvin knelt slowly before the memorial stone, something raw and unguarded finally breaking through 3 years of careful, bitter composure. I failed Corin, he said, voice thick. I failed him because my own grief made me reckless with decisions that should have been made carefully, soberly, with proper attention to the actual risk involved. I sent good men into compromised territory because I was too consumed by my own loss to properly weigh the cost to anyone else's family. That failure is mine entirely, Marcella. Not circumstance, not misfortune, not simply the unavoidable cost of leadership. My failure, born from grief I let curdle into recklessness rather than properly managing it. Marcella's composure finally broke fully, tears falling freely now, though something in her expression had shifted from raw anger into something more complicated and, perhaps, slightly less isolating. Thank you, she said, voice barely above a whisper, for finally saying it properly rather than hiding behind careful, distant sympathy. I'm sorry, Corvin said. Genuinely, completely sorry, in a way I should have found the courage to say directly 3 years ago, rather than hiding behind guilt that served only my own comfort rather than your actual grief. Thora, watching this exchange unfold, felt her own throat tighten with unexpected emotion, and beside her, Ash let out a soft, satisfied sound, as though the pup himself understood exactly how significant this particular moment had proven to be. I don't forgive easily, Marcella said finally, wiping at her face with unsteady hands. I won't pretend this conversation erases 3 years of genuine grief and anger in a single evening. I don't expect it to, Corvin said. I only hope it's a genuine beginning rather than another false start. It might be, Marcella admitted, something almost like relief settling into her tired expression. I think, for the first time in 3 years, I actually believe that might be possible. Ash chose that exact moment to abandon his post of quiet comfort in favor of enthusiastically greeting Corvin, tail wagging with the simple, uncomplicated joy that pups seem to bring to even the heaviest moments, and despite everything, the grief, the raw honesty, the 3 years of accumulated pain finally beginning to properly unravel, all 3 of them found themselves laughing, unexpectedly, at the pup's thoroughly inappropriate timing. He has a talent for that too, Thora said, wiping at her own unexpected tears, knowing exactly when a moment needs a little lightness to survive properly. A talent for knowing precisely what's needed, when it's needed, Corvin said, watching Ash demand attention from all 3 of them at once. I'm beginning to suspect that's a trait he learned from his handler. I contain multitudes, Thora said, and this time all 3 of them laughed properly, the chapel's heavy grief finally gently, making room for something that felt, unmistakably, like the genuine beginning of healing. The weeks that followed Marcella's reconciliation with Corvin brought a change to Castle Blackwood that even the oldest staff members remarked upon with visible wonder. Laughter in corridors that had stayed silent for 3 years, Corvin's council meetings running with noticeably less of the clipped, bitter efficiency that had once made his advisors dread every session. You've ruined him, Agnes announced one morning, watching Corvin attempt, with limited success, to referee a dispute between Biscuit and a particularly stubborn goose over territorial rights to a puddle. Ruined him properly. He used to terrify grown men with a single look. Now he's negotiating with poultry. I'd call it an improvement, personally. Oh, undoubtedly. I'm simply savoring the novelty. Agnes settled beside Thora, watching the king lose his negotiation with the goose entirely, Biscuit taking full advantage of the distraction to claim the puddle triumphantly. The whole castle's noticed, you know, not just his mood, the way he looks at you specifically. We're friends, Agnes. Recently arrived friends, given complicated circumstances. Friends don't typically abandon council meetings early to watch someone teach a three-legged pup obstacle courses, dear. I've served this family 30 years. I know the difference between friendship and whatever's currently blooming in that man's chest every time you enter a room. Thora felt her ears heat, watching Corvin finally abandon the negotiation entirely, laughing at his own defeat with an ease that would have been unimaginable 3 weeks earlier. It's complicated. Everything worth having usually is. Agnes patted her hand with brisk affection. Don't overthink it into something more complicated than it needs to be, girl. Life's given you enough genuine difficulty already. It was Juniper, Ash's inseparable sister, sharp and clever in ways that occasionally worried Thora with their sheer cunning, who provided the afternoon's unexpected complication, having discovered, with typical resourcefulness, a gap in the castle's formal dining hall that led directly beneath the head table. Your Majesty, a flustered servant reported, arriving at the barn with visible distress. There appears to be a wolf currently residing beneath the dining hall table, and the visiting trade delegation is due to arrive within the hour. Thora and Corvin exchanged a glance that had, over 3 weeks of shared chaos management, developed into a kind of wordless communication. Juniper, they said simultaneously, already moving. They found her exactly where reported, curled comfortably beneath the head table with the satisfied expression of a creature who had discovered the castle's single most strategically valuable napping location and had no intention of relinquishing it easily. Out, Thora said firmly, crouching to address the pup directly. This is not an acceptable napping spot, however excellent the shade. Juniper regarded her with the particular unbothered defiance that had, over 3 weeks, become her signature response to nearly every instruction, and burrowed deeper beneath the table instead. She's decided, Corvin observed, crouching beside Thora with visible amusement, that royal furniture is now pack territory. She's decided a great many things this week that weren't actually hers to decide. Yesterday, it was Lord Ashford's replacement roses. The day before, apparently, she convinced herself the laundry room was an acceptable secondary den. Thora reached beneath the table, attempting bribery in the form of a strip of dried meat she kept, with practiced foresight, in her cloak pocket for exactly this kind of emergency. Juniper, entirely unmoved by bribery for the first time in living memory, remained firmly planted. I believe, Corvin said slowly, fighting visible laughter. She's decided this spot holds some particular significance we're not yet aware of. It was Ash, arriving moments later in search of his sister, who finally solved the mystery, settling beside Juniper beneath the table with the same quiet, steady presence he'd offered Marcella in the chapel, and Thora understood, watching them, exactly what had drawn Juniper to that particular hidden spot. It's quiet here, she said softly. Enclosed. Safe. I think with the delegation's arrival preparations creating so much unfamiliar noise and activity throughout the castle today, she simply wanted somewhere that felt properly protected. Something in Corvin's expression softened considerably. That's remarkably perceptive of you. I've spent years learning to read what animals actually need beneath their surface behavior. It translates rather well to people, honestly, once you start paying proper attention. She reached beneath the table again, this time simply offering her palm rather than bribery, patient and unhurried. Come on, love. We'll find you somewhere equally quiet, just less likely to result in a diplomatic incident. Juniper, responding to the shift in approach rather than persistent instruction, finally allowed herself to be coaxed out, Ash following close behind, and the crisis resolved itself with considerably more ease than the initial panic had suggested was possible. That evening, with the trade delegation successfully hosted without further canine incident, Corvin found Thora in the castle gardens, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded her, unexpectedly, of the very flowers Marigold had demolished weeks earlier. "The delegation left impressed, apparently," he said, settling beside her. "Said something about the castle feeling considerably more alive than their previous visit 2 years ago. I imagine 18 wolf pups contribute meaningfully to that particular impression. I imagine you contribute rather more meaningfully than the pups alone, though they certainly help." He was quiet a moment, watching the sunset with her. "I wanted to ask you something, and I confess I've been building toward it rather slowly these past few days, uncertain how you'd receive it." "That sounds ominous." "It's not meant to be." He turned to face her properly. "I find myself increasingly unable to imagine this castle without you and your pack in it. I know it's only been 3 weeks. I know grief and loneliness can make a man see connection in circumstances that might not fully warrant it. But I don't think that's what's happening here, Thora. I think I've simply remembered watching you these past weeks, what it feels like to genuinely want something for myself again, rather than simply enduring each day out of obligation." Thora felt her breath catch, old caution warring with something considerably warmer. That's a significant admission for a king to make to a woman with 18 chaotic dependents and no formal standing whatsoever. I'm aware of exactly how significant it is. I find myself choosing to make it regardless. His hand found hers, careful and questioning. "I'm not asking for a decision tonight. I only wanted you to know plainly what I've been feeling, rather than letting it go unspoken indefinitely out of fear you might not feel the same." "I care for you too," Thora admitted, surprising herself with how readily the words came once she allowed herself to speak them. "More than I planned to, given that we met with me soaked through and responsible for 18 chaotic strangers who immediately began destroying your property. Best 3 weeks of destruction I've experienced in considerable time." His laugh was warm, genuine, and when he leaned in to kiss her, gentle, questioning, entirely without the practiced polish of court romance. Something in Thora's chest, guarded carefully through years of rejection and loss, finally, cautiously, allowed itself to hope properly. It was 3 days later that Marcella found Thora alone in the barn, her expression carrying a seriousness that immediately put Thora on alert. "I need to tell you something," Marcella said, settling onto a hay bale with visible reluctance. "About the council. About Lord Peregrine specifically." "That sounds significant." "It might be. I overheard him speaking with 2 other council members this morning, in careful, quiet tones that suggested they didn't want to be overheard." Marcella's expression had gone grim. "They're concerned about the king's growing attachment to you. Not simply personal disapproval, political concern. You have no formal standing, no pack lineage the council recognizes, no political alliance your relationship with him would secure. Some of them are beginning to argue that his judgment, still recovering from 3 years of grief, might be compromised by attachment to someone entirely unsuitable by traditional standard." Thora felt something cold settle in her stomach, old fear rising despite the weeks of genuine warmth she'd found within these walls. "They think I'm manipulating him." "Some of them do, yes. Peregrine specifically has been vocal about it. He's suggested quietly that your arrival and subsequent influence over the king's mood represents either remarkably convenient timing or deliberate calculation on your part." "That's absurd. I arrived soaked and exhausted in a storm with 18 pups. There was no calculation involved beyond simple survival." "I know that. Agnes knows that. Anyone who's actually watched you these past weeks knows that." Marcella's expression softened slightly. "But Peregrine doesn't operate on genuine observation, Thora. He operates on political calculation, and an Omega with no formal standing suddenly influencing the king's decisions represents, to men like him, a threat to the traditional order he's spent his career protecting." "What does he intend to do about it?" "I don't know precisely. I only know he's building some kind of case. gathering support among council members who share his concerns about propriety and precedent. I wanted you to have warning before whatever he's planning actually arrives at your doorstep." Thora absorbed this information slowly, old instincts toward self-protection warring with the genuine warmth she'd found in these past weeks. Should I leave? Before this becomes a genuine crisis for Corvin's rule? Absolutely not, Marcella said immediately, surprising them both with the sharpness of her response. I spent 3 years hating this man for a decision that cost me my brother. I've watched you help him become someone considerably better than the bitter, grieving figure I resented for so long. I won't watch some council politician's petty concern about propriety undo weeks of genuine healing. Not without a fight. That's remarkably fierce, coming from someone who threatened me directly upon our first proper conversation. People change, apparently. Or perhaps I simply recognized, watching you these past weeks, exactly what genuine goodness looks like when it's not performing for anyone's benefit. Marcella's expression had gone unexpectedly warm. I intend to speak with Corvin directly, warn him about Peregrine's building opposition, and help however I can to ensure this doesn't derail what's genuinely good for this entire castle, not just for the two of you personally. Corvin's reaction, when Marcella relayed the council's concerns that evening, proved considerably more controlled than Thora expected, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed genuine worry beneath the composed surface. Peregrine has always favored tradition over genuine judgment, he said, pacing the length of his study with barely restrained frustration. He opposed my father's more progressive trade policies decades ago on similar grounds, insisting proper precedent mattered more than actual outcomes. That doesn't make his current opposition less politically dangerous, Marcella pointed out. No, Corvin agreed grimly. It doesn't. He looked at Thora, something protective and fierce in his expression. I won't have you treated as some political liability to be managed or discarded based on Peregrine's narrow definition of proper standing. I don't want to become the reason your rule becomes unstable, Corvin. If my presence genuinely threatens your ability to govern effectively, it doesn't threaten my ability to govern. It threatens Peregrine's comfortable assumptions about how things ought to properly work, which is an entirely different problem, and one I'm considerably more willing to fight. His jaw had set with the particular determination Thora had glimpsed occasionally beneath his grief-worn exterior, the ghost of the decisive leader he'd apparently once been before loss had hollowed him out. I intend to address this directly with the full council, rather than allowing Peregrine to build quiet opposition through careful insinuation. That's a considerable risk, Marcella said. Direct confrontation might simply harden his position rather than resolving it. Perhaps, but I've spent 3 years allowing careful, quiet management to substitute for genuine leadership. And I've watched what that cost this castle, this council, and the people who depend on my actual judgment rather than my careful avoidance of conflict. Corvin looked between them both, something resolute settling into his expression. I don't intend to make that same mistake regarding someone this important to me. That night, unable to sleep despite the day's heavy revelations, Thora found herself in the barn long after the pups had settled, running through every possible outcome with the same careful, protective instinct she brought to every threat facing her pack. Ash found her there, patting quietly to settle against her side with the same instinctive comfort he'd offered Marcella weeks earlier, and Thora found herself, unexpectedly, grateful for the pup's quiet, steady presence. I don't know how to fight political opposition, love, she murmured, scratching gently behind his ears. I know how to fight for creatures the world's decided to discard. I don't know the first thing about council politics or proper standing or whatever else Peregrine intends to weaponize against me. Corvin found her there an hour later, having apparently gone searching once he noticed her absence from the small quarters Agnes had insisted on arranging for her within the castle proper weeks earlier. You're worrying, he observed, settling beside her. I'm cataloging, remember? Old habit. I remember. He took her hand, gentle and certain despite the day's tension. Whatever Peregrine intends, whatever political battle this becomes, I need you to know I'm not choosing caution over you, Thora. Not this time. I spent 3 years choosing caution over genuine engagement with my own grief, and it cost me considerably more than any political battle ever could. That's a significant commitment given how new this still is between us. I contain multitudes of significant commitments, apparently, made increasingly quickly since a particular storm-soaked midnight upended every careful, bitter routine I'd built for myself. His hand tightened around hers. I intend to fight for this, for you, for whatever this castle's becoming now that it's remembered how to properly heal rather than simply endure. Peregrine's outdated concerns about proper standing won't change that. Thora studied him in the dim barn light, old caution slowly, cautiously giving way to genuine hope, and found herself, despite the looming political complications, deeply grateful for the storm that had, weeks earlier, driven her directly into exactly the life she hadn't known she was searching for. The formal council session convened 3 days later, the chamber filled with more tension than Thora had witnessed in her weeks at Castle Blackwood, elders and advisors settling into their seats with the particular careful stillness of people anticipating conflict. "You didn't have to attend," Corvin murmured, finding her outside the chamber doors, dressed in the simple but well-tailored clothes Agnes had insisted upon for the occasion. "I could have addressed this without requiring you to stand before Peregrine's scrutiny directly. I've stood before harsher scrutiny than a council chamber, Corvin. An entire village decided I was a witch worth burning out of her own barn. I think I can survive Lord Peregrine's disapproval. That doesn't mean you should have to." "No," she agreed. "But I'd rather face this directly than hide in the barn wondering what's being decided about my future without my input." She squeezed his hand once, steadying them both. "Besides, someone needs to be there to keep Biscuit from wandering in and chewing on Peregrine's ceremonial robes, given his established history with expensive footwear." That earned a genuine, if strained, laugh from Corvin, and together they entered the chamber. Lord Peregrine stood at the council's center when they arrived, an older wolf with silver-streaked hair and the particular bearing of a man who'd spent decades believing his own judgment infallible. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing with precise, correct formality that somehow managed to convey disapproval despite its technical politeness. "I'm relieved you've called this session yourself. It saves the council the discomfort of raising the matter unprompted. Speak plainly, Peregrine. I'd rather address your concerns directly than dance around careful political phrasing." "Very well." Peregrine's gaze shifted to Thora, assessing and cool. "The council has observed with growing concern your increasing attachment to this woman. An Omega with no pack lineage recognized by this territory, no formal standing, and, if I may speak candidly, a recent history of expulsion from her own village, for reasons that remain somewhat unclear. I was expelled for taking in orphaned and rejected pups that no pack wanted," Thora said, meeting his gaze directly. "If that's the crime you're referencing, I'll own it fully, and without shame." A murmur moved through the assembled council at her directness, and Peregrine's expression tightened slightly. "The specifics of your expulsion matter less than the pattern it suggests," Peregrine said. "A woman with no formal ties, no political alliance to offer, whose sudden and considerable influence over the king's judgment coincides precisely with his willingness to abandon 3 years of careful, measured governance in favor of—" He gestured vaguely, "whatever this current sentiment represents." "You're suggesting my grief was somehow superior governance to whatever's changed these past weeks," Corvin said, voice gone dangerously flat. "I'd remind you, Peregrine, that my careful, measured governance during those 3 years cost Marcella's brother his life, through my own reckless decision-making, driven by grief I refuse to properly address. If that's the standard you're arguing to return to, I'd suggest reconsidering your position rather carefully." The chamber went very still at that direct reference, several council members exchanging uneasy glances. Elder Morwenna, an older woman whose careful, measured presence Thora had noticed throughout the proceedings, saying nothing until this exact moment, finally rose to speak. "I've served on this council for 23 years, she said, voice carrying clearly across the chamber. "I watched this king's father, and I've watched this king's own reign, through both its bitter years and whatever transformation these past weeks apparently represent. I'd like to ask Lady Thora a direct question, if the council permits." "Of course," Thora said, grateful for what felt like genuine curiosity rather than hostile interrogation. "What do you want, specifically, from your relationship with the king? Not what you believe you should say to satisfy this council's concerns. The actual truth." Thora considered the question carefully before answering. "I want him to be happy. I want the castle to keep healing the way it's been healing these past weeks, because I've watched what that healing costs when it doesn't happen. I've watched Marcella carry 3 years of unresolved grief. I've watched staff flinch at the king's presence out of learned fear. I've watched an entire castle forget what warmth felt like. If my presence here contributes to that healing, then yes, I want to stay, and I want whatever relationship Corvin and I are building to continue growing. But I don't want political standing, Elder Morwenna. I don't want influence over council decisions or formal power I haven't earned through actual understanding of this territory's governance. I simply want the chance to keep helping this place heal, alongside a man I've come to care for deeply." Elder Morwenna studied her for a long moment, something approving settling into her weathered expression. "That's a remarkably honest answer for someone facing this particular scrutiny. I've found honesty saves considerable time, particularly in rooms full of people prepared to assume the worst regardless." A ripple of quiet, surprised laughter moved through several council members at that, and even Peregrine's carefully composed expression flickered with something like reluctant respect. "I'd add," Marcella said, rising from her seat near the chamber's edge, surprising the entire council with her unexpected participation, "that I have perhaps more reason than anyone in this chamber to distrust easy explanations for the king's changed behavior. I lost my brother to this king's grief-driven recklessness 3 years ago. I have spent every day since serving him with barely concealed resentment." The chamber's attention shifted fully toward her, and Marcella continued, voice steady despite the visible effort it cost her. "I watched Lady Thora arrive 3 weeks ago, soaked and exhausted, responsible for 18 creatures the world had discarded. I watched her extend the same patient understanding to my grief that she extends to every rejected, wounded creature she's ever taken in. And I watched the king, for the first time in 3 years, actually sit with me properly and offer the genuine accountability I'd needed for 3 years to finally begin healing." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through it. "That's not manipulation, Lord Peregrine. That's not calculated political maneuvering. That's simply what happens when someone genuinely kind enters a space that's forgotten how kindness works. I'd think this council, of all bodies, would recognize the difference between genuine transformation and calculated performance." Peregrine was quiet for a long moment, clearly unsettled by the unexpected weight of Marcella's testimony. "I don't doubt your genuine experience, Marcella," he said finally, some of his earlier certainty visibly shaken. "I simply worry about precedent, about what it means for future succession, for the territory's stability, if the king's partner holds no formal standing this council recognizes." "Then let's discuss precedent honestly," Corvin said, stepping forward. "I'm not asking this council to formally recognize a marriage today. I'm asking this council to trust my judgment regarding my own personal life, the same judgment you've trusted regarding trade policy, territorial disputes, and matters of considerably greater consequence than who I choose to care for. If concrete concerns arise regarding actual governance, address them directly. But I won't have Thora's character questioned based on assumptions about calculation that every person who's actually observed her these past weeks knows to be entirely unfounded." The council deliberated for the better part of an hour, voices rising and falling in careful debate, while Thora sat beside Corvin, exhaustion and nerves both pulling at her in equal measure. It was, unexpectedly, Peregrine himself who finally shifted the room's trajectory. I came to this session prepared to argue formal caution, bordering on outright objection, he said, rising to address the full assembly. I've spent this past hour watching Lady Thora answer difficult questions with more honesty than most political actors offer, even under friendly circumstances. I've watched Marcella, whose grief and anger toward this king I've personally witnessed for 3 years, offer unexpected testimony in her favor. He paused, something almost humbled in his stern expression. I don't fully release my concerns about precedent and formal standing, but I'm prepared to withdraw a formal objection, provided this council maintains reasonable oversight as matters develop further, rather than allowing personal sentiment alone to dictate territorial policy. The vote, when finally called, passed with considerably more support than Thora had dared hope for. Formal acknowledgement of Thora's continued presence at Castle Blackwood, with reasonable council oversight, but no immediate objection to whatever relationship continued developing between her and the king. You did that, Corvin murmured, once the session had concluded, relief evident in every line of his exhausted face. Turned an entire skeptical council toward acceptance through nothing but honest, direct answers. Marcella did considerably more of that than I did, honestly. Her testimony carried more weight than anything I could have offered alone. Marcella, overhearing this from nearby, offered a small, genuine smile. I've spent 3 years letting grief keep me silent about what I actually believed. It felt considerably better, finally, to speak honestly instead. It was 2 weeks after the council session, with the castle settling into a new, more stable rhythm. That scrap, the smallest and most fragile of Thora's pack, fell seriously ill. Fever, Thora said, hands moving with practiced urgency over the small 3-legged pup's trembling body, worry etched deep into every line of her face. High fever, and he's barely eating. This isn't ordinary illness. Corvin was beside her within moments, having abandoned council business the instant word reached him, his own expression tight with genuine concern. What does he need? Willow bark, properly prepared, clean water kept warm, and considerable luck if I'm honest, given how fragile he's always been. The castle's physician, summoned immediately, confirmed Thora's assessment with grave seriousness. The fever's concerning, given his already compromised constitution. I'll do everything possible, but I won't offer false reassurance about the outcome. What followed was a long, exhausting night, Thora refusing to leave Scrap's side for even a moment, Corvin remaining close throughout, despite the pressing council business awaiting his attention, and the rest of the pack, sensing the severity of the situation, gathering quietly around the small, struggling pup with the particular gentle solidarity wolves instinctively offered their weakest members. He was left to die once already, Thora said quietly, sometime past midnight, exhaustion and fear both evident in her strained voice. I found him barely breathing in a ditch, 3 days old, discarded because he was too small, too weak to be worth the resources. I promised him, that first night, that I wouldn't let the world's judgment about his worth become true. You haven't, Corvin said gently. You've given him 3 years of genuine life he wouldn't have had otherwise. Whatever happens tonight, that truth doesn't change. I know that logically. It doesn't make watching him struggle any easier. Corvin took her hand, steady and present despite his own visible worry. Then let me sit with you through it, whatever the night brings. The fever broke just before dawn, Scrap's breathing finally settling into something less labored, his small body relaxing into genuine rest rather than feverish struggle for the first time in hours. He's going to be all right, the physician confirmed, examining him with visible relief. The worst has passed. He'll need careful monitoring over the coming days, but I believe he's through the most dangerous portion of this illness. Thora's composure, held together through sheer determination throughout the long night, finally broke entirely. tears of relief spilling over as she gathered Scrap gently against her chest. "You did it, love," she murmured against his fur. "You stubborn, impossible creature. You did it." Corvin, watching this display of raw, unguarded emotion, felt something shift fully into place in his own chest, the last hesitant caution finally giving way to complete, unreserved certainty. "Marry me," he said quietly, the words arriving without the careful planning he'd intended for such a significant moment, simply surfacing naturally from the weight of the night's shared vigil. Thora looked up, startled, tears still wet on her face. That's a remarkably undramatic proposal, delivered at dawn after an exhausting night watching a sick pup recover. "I find I've stopped caring about proper drama, given everything we've weathered together these past weeks. I only know that watching you tonight, refusing to leave his side, pouring every ounce of yourself into saving one small, fragile life the world once decided wasn't worth the trouble. I've never been more certain of anything in my entire life. I want exactly this, Thora. Not the performance of romance, but this. The genuine, exhausting, worthwhile work of building something real together." Thora studied him for a long moment. Exhaustion and joy tangled together so completely she could barely separate them. Scrap's small, recovering body warm against her chest. "Yes," she said finally, and meant it completely. Around them, as if sensing the significance of the moment, the rest of the pack began stirring from their protective circle, tails wagging with simple, uncomplicated joy at Scrap's recovery, and Biscuit, predictably, chose that exact moment to attempt, once again, to claim Corvin's boots as his own personal territory. "Some things," Corvin said, laughing despite the tears still on his own face, "apparently never change." "Get used to it," Thora said, laughing through her own relief and joy. "This is precisely what you're signing up for, Your Majesty. 18 chaotic dependents, a fair number of ruined boots, and considerably more love than either of us expected to find in a storm-soaked barn 3 weeks ago. I contain multitudes," Corvin said, echoing her own favorite phrase with warm, genuine affection. "Apparently that now includes 18 wolf pups, and the most remarkable woman I've ever known." News of the engagement spread through Castle Blackwood with the particular speed reserved for genuinely joyful gossip, and by midday, Agnes had already begun planning a celebration with the same brisk efficiency she brought to every crisis and triumph alike. "Small," Thora insisted, watching Agnes's enthusiasm build toward something considerably grander than she'd intended. "I don't need an elaborate ceremony, Agnes. I need something honest, with people who actually matter present." "Small and honest," Agnes agreed, though her expression suggested she'd already begun mentally expanding the guest list considerably beyond what small typically implied. "Though I'll remind you, dear, that this castle hasn't had genuine cause for celebration in 3 years. Let an old woman have her joy, even if the wedding itself stays modest." Marcella, arriving mid-conversation with an armful of fabric samples Agnes had apparently already commissioned without formal permission, offered Thora a sympathetic look. "You won't win this particular argument? I'd suggest conserving your energy for battles you have better odds against. You seem remarkably at peace with all this chaos, given how recently you were warning me about political opposition." Peregrine's opposition, while genuine, was never truly about me personally. Marcella gestured at the fabric samples, at Agnes's barely contained excitement, at the general warmth that had settled over the castle these past weeks. "This is simply good news arriving after 3 years of very little. I find myself considerably more invested in celebrating it than I expected to be." It was Elder Morwenna who requested a private audience with Thora that same afternoon, her expression carrying the particular seriousness of someone with something important, if not urgent, to discuss. "I wanted to speak with you before the formalities of engagement consume all your attention," Elder Morwenna said, settling into the small sitting room Agnes had arranged for exactly this kind of private conversation. about the Council's continued oversight and what it will actually mean for your role here going forward. I appreciate the directness. I'd rather understand the reality clearly than discover complications later. The Council will expect you to gradually take on more formal responsibility once the marriage is properly recognized. Not political power exactly, but a role, overseeing matters related to territorial welfare perhaps, given your evident talent for recognizing what struggling creatures and struggling people both genuinely need. Elder Morwenna studied her carefully. I raise this not as a burden, but as an opportunity. This territory has needed, for considerable time, someone willing to advocate for those the traditional systems tend to overlook. Thora considered this, something warming in her chest at the possibility. I'd want that role, honestly. I've spent years advocating for creatures nobody else valued properly. I think I'd find genuine purpose extending that same advocacy to people facing similar dismissal. I suspected as much. Elder Morwenna's stern expression softened into something almost approving. Peregrine remains cautious, but I believe, given time and continued evidence of your genuine character, even his skepticism will properly ease. He's not a cruel man, Thora, whatever his careful, tradition-bound manner suggests. Simply someone who's learned, through decades of careful political maneuvering, to distrust anything that arrives without proper precedent to explain it. I understand that instinct better than he probably realizes. I've spent considerable time distrusting good fortune myself, given how rarely the world's extended it to me without eventual complication. Perhaps you two have more in common than either of you currently recognizes. That evening, Corvin found Thora in the barn. Tending Scrap's continued recovery with the same careful attention she'd shown throughout his illness, though the pup's improved energy, currently attempting, with limited success, to steal a treat from his sister's careful guard, suggested the worst had genuinely passed. Elder Morwenna spoke with you, he said, settling beside her. She did. About formal responsibility eventually. About advocating for this territory's overlooked and struggling members, the way I've always advocated for overlooked and struggling animals. Thora glanced at him. I want that role, Corvin. Genuinely. I think I'd find real purpose in it. I think you'd be remarkable at it. He was quiet a moment, watching Biscuit make yet another valiant, doomed attempt on his boots. I wanted to discuss something else, actually. Something I've been considering since the council session. That sounds significant. Marcella's testimony that day. Her willingness to speak honestly about Karan's death, about my failure, in front of the full council. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, something thoughtful in his expression. I've decided I want to establish something formal, in Karan's memory. A proper training program for the King's Guard, focused specifically on careful, sober decision-making under emotional strain, something to ensure no future king, myself included in whatever years remain of my own reign, ever again sends good men into danger while too consumed by grief to properly assess the actual risk. Something in Thora's chest tightened with genuine emotion at that. That's a remarkable tribute. I'd like Marcella to help design it if she's willing. She understands, better than anyone, exactly what failure of judgment that program needs to prevent. He glanced at Thora. I wanted your input as well, honestly. You've a talent for recognizing what genuinely helps versus what merely performs helpfulness. I trust your judgment on this matter considerably. I'd be honored to help. And I think Marcella would find real healing in shaping something meaningful from what was, for so long, simply raw grief. Marcella's reaction, when Corvin proposed the idea the following day, proved everything they'd hoped for. Genuine, unguarded emotion breaking through her usually composed exterior. You want to name it after him, she said, voice unsteady. Properly, publicly. The Corin Ashwood Training Initiative, Corvin confirmed, focused on exactly the kind of careful judgment that might have prevented his loss, taught to every new recruit joining the King's Guard going forward. I'd like his memory to become something that actively protects future guards, rather than simply a private grief carried quietly. Marcella's composure finally broke entirely, tears falling freely as she absorbed the weight of the gesture. 3 years. I've felt like his death simply vanished into administrative silence, acknowledged briefly, and then quietly filed away. This... She gestured, unable to fully articulate the emotion. This actually means something. This actually keeps him present in a way that matters. You'll help design the program's actual curriculum? Corvin asked. I want your direct input, not simply your name attached to something built without you. Yes, Marcella said immediately, wiping at her tears with unsteady hands. Yes, absolutely. I'd want nothing more. The wedding, when it finally arrived 3 weeks later, proved exactly as small and honest as Thora had insisted, despite Agnes's persistent efforts toward grander scale. Held in the castle gardens Marigold had once famously demolished, now restored with new roses that Lord Ashford himself had personally selected as a gift. 18 pups attended with considerably more dignity than the ceremony's early planning had suggested possible. Scrap fully recovered and settled proudly at the front alongside Ash and Juniper, while Biscuit, predictably, spent most of the ceremony eyeing Elder Morwenna's formal footwear with concerning interest. Marcella stood as Thora's chosen witness, her presence a testament to exactly how far both she and Corvin had traveled these past months, and Agnes wept openly throughout, insisting between happy sobs that she'd known this outcome was inevitable from the very first storm-soaked night. I never expected this, Thora murmured to Corvin, midway through the ceremony, watching her pack settle around them with obvious contentment. 3 months ago, I was standing at your gate, soaked through, uncertain whether you'd offer shelter or turn us away entirely. I never expected it either, Corvin admitted. 3 months ago, I'd convinced myself bitterness was simply who I'd permanently become. I'm endlessly grateful you proved that particular certainty wrong. You proved it wrong yourself, honestly. I only offered the space for you to remember who you'd been before grief calcified into something harder. Perhaps we managed it together then. That seems more accurate than either of us claiming sole credit. They exchanged vows that were, true to Thora's insistence, honest rather than elaborate. Promises of genuine partnership, of continued healing, of building something together that honored both what they'd each lost and what they'd found in each other's unexpected company. When Corvin kissed her, gentle and certain in the fading afternoon light, the entire pack erupted into enthusiastic, undignified celebration, tails wagging and voices raised in the particular joyful chaos only 18 wolf pups could properly provide. Some things, Corvin said, laughing against her lips, apparently never change. Get used to it, Thora said, laughing through her own overwhelming joy. This is precisely what you signed up for, Your Majesty. Behind them, watching the celebration with visible, if carefully restrained satisfaction, Lord Peregrine found himself unexpectedly offering a genuine smile to Elder Morwenna. I confess, he said quietly, I may have been wrong about this particular precedent. You may have been, Elder Morwenna agreed, equally quiet, equally pleased. There are considerably worse things a man can be wrong about, Peregrine. I'd say this ranks among the better mistakes to have made. Epilogue. 2 years later, Castle Blackwood bore little resemblance to the cold, grief-hardened place Thora had stumbled into that storm-soaked midnight. Its corridors filled now with the particular warm chaos of a household that had, slowly and deliberately, chosen healing over endurance. The 18 pups had grown into distinct, thriving young wolves, each carrying some echo of the courage that had first brought them into Thora's care. Scrap, against every early prediction about his fragility, had grown into one of the pack's most determined members. His 3-legged gait no longer a source of worry, but simply an unremarkable fact of who he was. currently serving with visible pride as the castle's unofficial ambassador to visiting delegations. Having developed a particular talent for charming even the most stern-faced nobles. Marigold's relationship with the castle's rose garden had, remarkably, evolved into something like careful truce, Lord Ashford having taken to personally supervising her visits with the patient indulgence of a man who'd long since decided the pup's enthusiasm outweighed any remaining concern about his flowers. Biscuit remained, entirely unrepentant, the castle's most prolific destroyer of royal footwear. A fact Corvin had eventually addressed by simply purchasing considerably sturdier boots, having accepted with genuine good humor that certain battles weren't worth continued fighting. Marcella's Koran Ashwood Training Initiative had, in the 2 years since its founding, become one of the territory's most respected programs, training guards not just in tactical skill, but in the careful, sober judgment that grief and pressure so easily eroded. Marcella herself now oversaw it fully. Her relationship with Corvin settled into something considerably warmer than the wary truce it had once been. Not quite family in blood, but family in every way that had come to matter. He'd be proud, she told Thora once, watching a new class of recruits complete their training. Corin, I mean. I used to worry that moving forward meant forgetting him. I understand now that it simply means honoring him properly, by making sure his loss actually meant something. Peregrine, true to Elder Morwenna's prediction, had gradually softened his earlier skepticism into genuine, if characteristically reserved, respect, becoming unexpectedly one of Thora's most consistent allies on the council whenever matters of territorial welfare arose. Thora and Corvin's own family had grown as well, not through blood. Though a daughter had arrived the previous spring, small and fierce, and already showing an unmistakable talent for commanding the attention of every pup in her vicinity, but through the ever-expanding definition of family that Thora had spent her entire life quietly building, one rejected creature at a time. Standing in the castle gardens one autumn evening, watching her daughter toddle unsteadily between Scrap and Ash's careful supervision, while Corvin looked on with the particular soft wonder that had become permanent since the storm that first brought Thora to his gate, she felt the full weight of everything that single desperate night had ultimately given them both. Regrets? Corvin asked, settling beside her, watching their daughter attempt, with limited success, to climb onto Biscuit's patient back. Not a single one, Thora said, though I confess I never expected any of this, standing at your gate that storm-soaked night. I only wanted shelter for creatures nobody else wanted. You found considerably more than shelter in the end. So did you, she said softly. I think we found each other exactly when we both needed finding most. The evening settled gold and peaceful around them. 18 wolves, no longer pups, though the name had stuck regardless, moving easily through gardens that had once belonged only to careful ceremony and quiet grief, now belonging fully to a family built from stubborn kindness, honest reckoning, and the simple, hard-won understanding that even the coldest hearts could learn, given proper patience and proper love, to thaw completely. If this story found its way into your heart, the storm-soaked gate, the chapel where grief finally found its voice, the small, fierce pup who taught a king what genuine hope looked like, I'd love to hear which part stayed with you. And if you're hungry for another tale of stubborn healing and families built from unlikely beginnings, just say the word.